Hello, my name is Anita Hughes, and yes, I am the author of the book called Making Friends, and I'm an educational psychologist and have been an educational psychologist for near on 40 years now. And about 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, I decided to set up independent practice, and a main part of my independent practice has been running therapeutic groups, social and therapeutic groups for children on the autism spectrum. And because of the interest from parents, from professionals, teachers and psychologists and other people like speech and language therapists, all expressing an interest in the work I was doing, I really felt I needed to write it down, distill it so that other people could have the confidence to run their own groups on the lines of the friendly group, which is what I write about in my book, and also to give the parents an opportunity to have a greater understanding of their children and perhaps a different way that they could also be talking with their families, because obviously a family is also a group. It's not just in a formal setting.
So can you tell us something about what inspired you to specialise when you did in working with children and young people who are either formally called autistic or given that diagnosis, or perhaps thinking about them on a spectrum of different challenges? So what first inspired you to work with that cohort, with those young people?
I've always enjoyed working with children who've had difficulty in expressing themselves, in being able to show who they really are. I think it probably reflects back to my own childhood, where I used to find it quite difficult to get people to really notice me. So I've had an empathy with those kind of children. And the term autism, when I was studying psychology, was something that was a very extreme thing for those youngsters who have no communication skills, whose ability to participate in society is very limited. And then while I was working as an educational psychologist for a local authority, the term Asperger's began to come in, and I began to meet children who began to be diagnosed with what was called Asperger's. Now that term has become autism spectrum disorder, because obviously it's on a big spectrum. I've always had an anxiety about calling this a disorder, because
Yes.
it is a difference rather than a disorder. And this comes up a lot with the young people I work with. But when you're saying inspired about working with these kind of children, I found that in schools, I began to run groups for children who were shy or couldn't quite fit in, alongside the children who were also presenting with behavioural difficulties. And there's similarities across the board because we communicate through our behaviours as well. And I liked that kind of work so much that I wanted to be able to do more of it and not be constrained as a psychologist within the local education system of really doing assessments and consultation on a broad spectrum of difficulty. I wanted to be able to, if you like, dedicate myself more to direct work with families and with therapeutic work.
So there's something for you that attracts you to this group, something about that challenge to enable them to express themselves, enable them to be themselves. Is that how you
That's
see
right,
it?
that's right. In fact, I don't know if it would be of interest to you, but in my book, I've actually written a little bit, which I could quote from, about what I see as a therapy, as a difference between really teaching social skills, because a lot of people misunderstand the friendly group, that it's a social skills group. And while I explain, yes, your children will learn social skills, it is not a structured learning program. It's not a teaching program. There's a sort of a subtle difference. Therapy is not about targets. It's about relationships. I see the autistic child who is withdrawn and uncurious, locked in really, and does not join in a group, but then is drawn out, drawn into the group by other children's empathy, understanding, benign tolerance, and patience. When they become drawn in by other children who are like themselves, it creates a little bit of connection, like a little thread. That thread is what pulls the child out of the locked-in place, and they begin to get a sense of another person, of an adult or a child, rather than just themselves. They begin to experience a little bit of belonging in the group. And as week after week, small links between children are made, more and more threads are woven into the fabric of shared experience and meaning. They begin to know what it feels like to be part of something. As the children begin to help each other, they get past the narcissistic state of all about me and move into you and me. So really, and I've said really at the end of this, I'm saying in the long term, what matters are the relationships we create together. It's the relationships in the groups is what makes them so potent.
Could you tell us about some of the major influences on your thinking in terms of how you've approached running the friendly group with this group of young people?
I started running groups in schools when I was working as an educational psychologist in schools. And I suppose I was basing my the way I ran groups at that time on my educational psychology background about how children learn. I was probably, well, I was following some basic sort of social skills kind of programs, which were quite structured, which was very helpful to me as a leader. But what I found was that it didn't always, I found myself actually moving into a more intuitive way of working, of responding to the children rather than sticking to a script, because quite a lot of social skills work is hypothetical things where you're thinking of a hypothetical situation and discussing it together. And that's very good. But when I started running the friendly group and was doing it along these lines, I was very lucky to begin to have supervision with someone with whom I'm still helping me and supporting me, who is a group analyst. And so obviously works with psychodynamic thinking. And she helped me alongside my reading of Irvin Yalom, who is a psychiatrist in America who's written many books on group therapy, group psychoanalytic therapy. And the real influence for me on the groups and how I really have not changed the way I work, but had more confidence is working through something which Yalom calls group process. And group process is not so much about what the children are doing or saying. In other words, the content, it might be how they're behaving or, what they've said and if it's interesting or not. It's much more at looking at the here and now feelings, emotional temperature, if you like, and feelings and articulating those feelings within the group. So the children might talk about, for example, and I've discussed this in my book, on a subject like bullying, and rather than it just be the hypothetical subject, not hypothetical even, but rather than it being the subject of bullying that's happening outside the group and not in the group, what I'm tuning into is when there might be misunderstandings in the group. With autistic children, very easy for them to misunderstand another person's intention and feel that they're being bullied. And with their rigid thinking, they can often become resentful of that other person and unforgiving, if you like. And often the most potent parts of the group are when things do go a little bit wrong, if you like, when there are the misunderstandings that could look to an outsider as those tense moments that we want to correct. We need to correct that behavior, that they should not be saying something like that. The terminology we might use is, well, I wonder how what you have said might have affected somebody else in the group, or can you see how that person is feeling? Or I might ask the other person who's been on the receiving end of something that's not directed at them but you can tell has upset them, and say, I wonder how you're feeling about Johnny, let's say, talking about this. And they might say, I'm feeling very uncomfortable. And then we can have a discussion about how that makes the speaker feel the person, Johnny, who's doing the speaking, that he's made somebody else feel uncomfortable. And then it becomes alive, because the whole group can be talking about what's actually happening in that group. And a lot of the book is about stories, is about the stories of real children and real encounters. And because I have a colleague who writes down what the children are saying, the actual language that is used when I've written down dialogue is what the children have said. So it's not made up. What I've done is I changed the children's names and sort of circumstances so they've become anonymous. But the actual situations really happened to illustrate things like the group process. And I suppose you said in the question you asked me, another influence, which I'm very mindful of, is about attachment theory. And I'm very mindful of that because, and I dedicate a whole chapter of this in my book about, is it attachment difficulty or is it autism? And in a way, this is a whole different other question, because if you like, all children on the autism spectrum have some level of attachment difficulties. And it's because my understanding of autism spectrum disorder or difference or whatever language we talk about is the children are very sensitive, and they might be very sensitive to sound, movement, noise, visual impact, and emotionally sensitive. And if a baby comes into the world and is finding there's the sensory information coming in too stimulating, it makes sense that those children are either shutting down or crying a lot. And it makes sense that parents who are responding to their babies and giving to their babies and trying to create that bond might also find there are difficulties because their baby is not responding in a way that is comfortable and what have you. So but there are some children who seem to have more difficulties in the attachments they've made with parents. And so I've tried to explain these differences in an early chapter in my book, because it's not putting kind of blame anywhere. It's really to give explanation that supports families and supports professionals, because it's so easy to compartmentalize children into something like, well, they've got an attachment disorder, or they've got a communication disorder, or they've got autism. And really, children are far more complex and interesting, and relationships are far more complex and interesting, and actually far more repairable, if you like, if there is understanding and people feel more confident.
So from the way you're describing it, it sounds like it's really important for you to stay in the here and now with what the children and young people bring to the group experience. But does that mean that you have no particular structures in the kind of groups that you talk about in your book?
I feel I should be very clear that although we're working with the here and now, what comes up in the group, there is very much a structure, because the structure is what helps keep the children or enable the children to feel safe. They know what's going to be happening. And we have a 6 rhythms, I call them, through the book, starting off with a circle time, which means the children each have a chance just to speak of anything they want to and be listened to. The next little part we call the bear cards. I use a resource called Bear Cards with Bears with Emotions, but in actual fact, we can do other aspects of talking about feelings. There's a worry bear we use as well. Then we move on to the bit that could be described as an activity, where the children can tell a story together. There's a whole chapter in the book about using children's imagination and creating a story together. Then the children have a little break so that they have a chance to have a bit of a rest from the demands of joining in all together, but it gives them a chance to practice a bit of socializing with each other. And then we come back to the circle, and we have a final circle bit which is a reflective moment. We might be saying what's been a special moment. We might reflect on how different people have been kind to one another, what we found out about somebody else in that group. And then we finish off with a special way of saying goodbye, which we call the lighthouse goodbye, which I also describe in my book, which is where the children each have a turn using their eyes, a bit like lighthouse beams, to say goodbye and have a safe journey home. So there's very much a structure, a framework, but it's what comes up within the frame that is the important thing. So, you know, whatever comes up when they bring up their worries or their feelings, or what they bring up at the beginning when they're talking, you never know quite what they will bring or how they will respond to one another through the activities that we do with them.
When a child or young person joins the group, what sorts of things do they find challenging? What do you think takes the most time to get used to? Because I imagine this setting is not one that they come across very often.
No. Well, to answer your question, I think the first thing that's the most important thing is to help prepare children. And I always make sure that I meet children before they start, ideally about a week before the first session, even if I've met them in the past before with other work or just met them before, because I then can go through all those rhythms. I can show them the resources that I use. They come to the room in which they're going to be working, but obviously that's not always possible if somebody's working in the school or might be in a different room. But talking through every little detail, and I do find with children on the autistic spectrum, every little detail counts. I've even told them the kinds of biscuits they'll be eating, because I like to provide refreshments and in the choosing time. And it's amazing what kind of question, and then I say at the end, have you got any questions? And it's amazing the sort of the most extraordinary questions that can come up. I remember once a boy asked me, what happens if it's snowing? And interestingly, the only time I've ever cancelled a friendly group was due to the snow. And I think that that's another thing, is that the children are very attuned to what might go wrong because of all their high levels of anxiety. You know, a lot of this is allowing the children to talk about their uncomfortable feelings. So that's how I prepare them. And when they come the first time, they have a sense of what to expect. They've already met me, and I take photographs of the children, and I have albums, and I show the children photographs of other members of the group that I know if they're coming to that particular group, and it's with agreement of the parents. And these photographs are never shared beyond the family. They're not online or anything like that.
You've emphasised a couple of times this need for safety, the need for the children and young people to feel safe. You've talked about this level of anxiety. Would you just like to share your thinking about that?
Well, we're all anxious when we start something new. All of us feel anxious, but we manage that anxiety partly because we're able to rehearse in our minds maybe what's going to happen in the future. We're able to use our past experiences of when things have gone okay to remember those things. But I find a lot of the children, for either things have gone wrong for them so often that they don't trust that the next new thing isn't going to not work out for them, if you like. They often can be misunderstood by a lot of adults and are not yet just trusting that maybe I or my colleagues will understand them either. So there's a lack of trust thing to begin with. But I'm always amazed how almost by halfway through, talking about half an hour into the first session, I would say 90% of the children who come begin to relax. And it's amazing how by the end of the session, and we're asking, who would like to come back next week or something like that, often it's the newcomers' hands go up immediately because they felt relaxed, because we invite the children who have been there before. Our groups always have an element of a few children who've been like old handers, I call them in the book, and they will say, they will make an effort to tell the newcomers what it's like in the group, and invariably they say things like, nothing matters, anything will go in this group, everybody's friendly, it's called the friendly group because everyone's friendly. And they use a childlike language around expressing that they feel safe. And somehow it's hearing from their peers that this is an okay place to be, that I think is what helps the children to settle so quickly.
Yes, that peer-to-peer communication sounds as if it's really crucial, really, if they're probably going to listen to their peers more than they'll listen to the adults. Yeah.
Yes.
And do you feel that the children quite quickly acclimatized to sharing space? Is sharing an issue?
Well, it's interesting because I've always said from sharing, I used to work years ago with in the early years field. And of course, you know, what does sharing mean to a 2-year-old? And sharing really is not about, I mean, the only thing I can think of share is like on a seesaw or something, because usually sharing means taking turns and trusting that you will get your turn back again. Now, with a 2-year-old, it might be a particular toy. You're sharing a toy, or you're usually handing the toy over for a while in the hope you'll get it back again. If you like, in a group like the friendly group, it's trusting that you will have your turn, if you like. The sharing is more about sharing of yourself. So it's the trusting of talking, but also trusting that you're not going to be interrupted. And I think the structure of the very beginning of the session with this circle time, where in pre-COVID times, if you like, we would pass a stone round. Now I'm holding a stone and saying we're pretending to pass the stone round. But when you've got that object in your hand, that's your time you can speak, and you know that your time is being protected and no one's going to interrupt. And if they do, that's where we as adults will step in and say, remember, with the stone, it's your turn to speak. And when you haven't got the stone, it's your turn to listen. Some children don't want to speak with the stone, but that's all right, because they've got a chance to say, I don't want to speak right now. But that gives, if you like, the foundation of how we share time.
And share time, share attention, share energy, share all of those things, really.
Yes,
share focus
but
in some way.
And also interestingly about sharing is about turn taking. That's what it's really about. And I know that I do tell a story, as I say, the book's full of stories about 2 children who wanted to go first in the part. I think it was the part about doing one of our stories, and I've described how they negotiated that, and with some help on understanding that negotiation, because of course that's the foundation of social skills, being able to negotiate, being able to listen to somebody else and trust other people, and bear it, if you like, if you don't get quite what you want. So if, you know, 2 want to be first, what are the benefits of being second?
I think a lot of us could probably learn that. It's like, or vice versa. What are the benefits of being first? So you talked about the role of imagination in creating stories together. And I guess the cliche around children on the spectrum or with these kinds of diagnoses trying to describe what's happening with them, sometimes it's thought that either there is little imagination and things are taken very, very literally. And I think there can sometimes be quite an aversion to stories that are based in fantasy. We'd rather have a real story, or real story about real people. Well, what's the point of a story that's about a fantasy? But you're describing imagination in the group as something both individual and collective. So that's interesting. I mean, talk about how that comes up in the group.
Yes. Many people do imagine that children on the autism spectrum don't have imagination. And the difficulty with expressing imagination or using imagination is often compromised, I think, by anxiety. A lot of things associated with children on the autism spectrum, what do you call it, a lot of their problems are linked to anxiety. And what I've discovered is that when the children are relaxed with each other, they're very good with imagination. They can come up with very good ideas. But not all children, obviously, because there are children who would prefer things to be factual. And again, it's respecting children's differences and difficulties. But what I found is that, particularly with the younger children, using their imagination through creating a story and I've written in quite depth in the book a whole chapter on the process of writing a story over several weeks, where the children will, often the stories have are to do with a quest, you know, and that kind of story, and they will take turns on giving a little bit of the story, and my colleague writes up what the children are saying, I type them up, and then next week we carry on and we read back what they've said last week. And in the end of the set of sessions, because with the friendly group, it runs a sort of a group set of 6 sessions. So on the week 5, we finish the story, and then week 6, they take the book home. And within that process, what the children have the opportunity of doing is, if you like, they're not actually enacting it out, but they're enacting out in their imaginations aspects of themselves that they may not be able to show in real life, but they're doing it unconsciously. So it's a kind of a psychodynamic therapy, if you like, but for children at a level they can cope with. So quite often, timid children can be very confident, and they're the leaders in the story. We've had children who have difficulty feeling part of the group, who may be falling out of the vehicles, getting lost. And it's very, and while one's got to be careful about interpreting what the children say, and certainly be very mindful and careful of any interpretation in front of children, because it might make them self-conscious, but also might confuse or worry them, really, because for them stories are fun. But the imagination has got a lot of potency about it, and for younger children, it's a way of them getting to their more unconscious selves, or no, not unconscious selves. Well, it is unconscious. It's their inner selves, but at an unconscious level, and it's fun and it's satisfying. Though I do have to confess that a lot of characters that emerge in the stories are related to characters from computer games or current stories, and I'm so old-fashioned that I don't know who they are. So when they bring up characters that they want to bring into their stories, I haven't actually written this in my book, but what I say to the children is, can you describe this character so that children in this group who don't know who they are, they can imagine what this character looks like. So they do refer to real characters. They're not just, you know, it was a brown bear. It might be some, you know, they'll give a name to a character that's part of a computer game. And of course, their generation of interest, they usually know who these characters are anyway. But and that's how, you know, that's how we do it. But we also do stories that are just 1 week stories, you know, where they say something happened, you know, a sentence, a once upon a time story, and it's very important actually for children. It's not just using of imagination, it's also about narrative.
And I was also thinking it's also about listening to what your neighbour has contributed and accepting it, because I can imagine that sometimes they might get quite attached to what is going to happen to this character, but then somebody else suggests something else. So there must be quite a lot of, is there argument about that, with people who feel very committed to, no, this is what's going to happen? How do you navigate that together? Because that's another here and now learning experience.
You've raised a wonderful point, because that is often where the most aggravation can occur in the group, which is very lively. And how that, as you say, we use the here and now moment of how to resolve that difficulty. And it does get resolved, because you will always get some children who come up with a good solution, or children who are understanding. So you may have 2 not liking it, and a third will come up with a good idea that it fits in for both of the children, of 2 children who don't agree with one another. And there is sort of harmony and a realization there's no right or wrong way, but also recognizing at the end of the day, if a speaker, if their idea is not being accepted, it's got to be seriously considered, and ultimately it may well be accepted because it was their idea. But we have to get everybody on board.
Yeah, so there's a lot of real life examples for people to live through frustration and negotiation and patience, and I suppose the satisfactions of seeing their approach or idea being carried, but also being able to withstand the shame or the disappointment if the idea doesn't. All of that
Yes.
really wide spectrum of feelings that, you know, navigating whose idea is going to be the one that is, all of that flexibility that often again isn't necessarily associated with children who have these labels.
Yes, but but also another important thing, and I do again, it's within the book. I think it's in the chapter on the stories. Is that if I mentioned earlier that many children on the spectrum hold resentments. They find it very difficult to forgive other children because it's their rigid thinking. They're not being able to see a bigger picture, and their anxiety of sort of holding themselves together, if you like, is that's how I see it. And they what can happen in the story is where they might want to kill or injure another member of the group in the story, because usually the story is about the group members going on an adventure together. And that's when, and I think that that's where a lot of energy and work goes on into understanding where there are tensions and where there are anxieties for individuals. And I certainly describe, a couple of examples in my book here, but they happen all the time. I mean, it happened last Saturday in a group that I was only doing this Saturday over one person saying something that was really about killing somebody else in a story, and then us having to really talk about what that was meaning and how we could, because it was upsetting the other person and it was not acceptable.
Not acceptable, but nonetheless, you're not judging the person who says it. You're exploring why it was important for them to say it, aren't you? So there's a
That's
wonderful
right.
atmosphere of acceptance and non-judgment.
And talking about how they feel. How do you feel that somebody has said they want to kill you or throw you off or something? And they'll be saying, I don't like that. And how do you feel that that person's upset? And either they're able to say, well, I'm cross with them, but that's rare. What's more likely to say is, all right. And and suddenly they come out of the story and into the real group again. And they don't want to upset that other one because at the bottom line, there is this acceptance we always talk about in the group. We are kind to one another. And what does it mean to be kind to one another? And their experiences so often are of people's unkindness through not understanding them and through them making blunders, because if you like, they're only acting out, or they're acting out in the group or telling through the story how they may be behaving in school, because they can say very blunt things when they have been offended by other children through their misunderstanding or maybe genuine cruelty, but they can be very blunt themselves, which doesn't help with their own ability to make relationships outside the group.
So something else I'm really hearing and very much read and very moved really by so many of the accounts of the young people and the children in the groups that you run, that you talk about in the Friendly Group book, is about how the children really feel supported by each other there, and how often how lonely they are sometimes in a school setting or elsewhere, but here they have a real sense of belonging, which is a wonderful thing, and hopefully becomes a model for them for being able to belong elsewhere as well, that they can take it out from this group into their wider experience.
Well, I think that's really another reason for writing the book and for doing the group anyway. It's not about the Friendly Group being this sacred place. The whole purpose, the minute the children walk in, they're being prepared for their lives outside. And anybody who's running groups, it's really enabling them to be able to be successful outside. And the safety of the group gives children the experience of perhaps at a teenager level, having a bit of banter and it slightly being off, but then coping with it or things going wrong and learning, so that when they're in their own school settings or scouts or drama group or football club or whatever other group settings they find themselves in, they've had some experience of a bit of social experience in the group that they can then generalize outside, which really does happen. And I think that's what makes me very excited, is that it really does happen. And both parents and teachers of schools comment time and time again how they're noticing the children having more confidence with other children, and just being happier with themselves.
It's just really so key, isn't it? So key. So in this book, you've got lots of, you very much didn't want it to be a recipe book, but nonetheless, you have got take 10 young people and stir vigorously. But you did really want other people to be able to take from it some ideas if they wanted to set up a group themselves. So can you give us just any other thoughts you have about key ingredients that people would need to consider if they were going to set up a group along the lines of the friendly group, but very much for the same principles, really? I love that idea of as soon as they enter, they're being prepared to go out again. It's just a little time. It's not a sacred space. It's just a little time for some finding out how things could be a bit different to enable them to feel confident elsewhere, which is lovely. So if someone was going to set up a group like that, what key things would you want them to hold in mind?
Well, one of the things, the key things I would say is at a physical level, if it can be in the same room and at the same time, and a room where there will not be any interruptions, that is absolutely key. Because when I work in an environment for the friendly group that is not interrupted. I'm not interrupted, but I have worked in school environments where suddenly children have burst in, or children are walking past a window and making faces. That makes it feel unsafe. So the room needs to feel safe, that nobody will come in and they will not be disturbed. And if possible, the same room and the same time as well. And to have yourself prepared with the resources. I mean, I've talked about the bear cards as a resource I use. I have other games, 1 or 2 board games that I use to do with feelings. I've got my stone. I've got a little model lighthouse for the lighthouse goodbye. I've got a little teddy bear as the worry bear. My key resources, and whatever resources anyone wants to use for their groups, to make sure that they really have them every week and they have them ready before the children come in. I also have other resources like pencil and paper and crayons and things, because sometimes children just want to draw while the group's going on. Children, a lot of children, all children, there are some that really need to fiddle with things and they can't really sit still. And having, pencils and papers can be quite useful. So that's on a practical level. On another level is that if children are going to be absent for any reason, at the very beginning, we talk about who's there and who's not there. So we think about the ones who are not there. And so if you're not there, you're going to be thought about, but it also opens up possibilities. And again, we often talk about it in the here and now. How do you feel that, Jenny is not here this week? I wonder how it feels that Jenny's not here this week. And again, it brings it in the here and now, and we can talk about that and think about as the absent person. And it's very important to have a structure. The structure I have sort of put forward in my book, how the friendly group, it works for me, and it seems to have a rhythm, a starting point, thinking about feelings, bit of fun, bit of creativity, bit of a chill out, a reflective time, and then a goodbye. And how, even if as anybody can adapt things as they want to, but that sort of rhythm of a way of enabling us to settle in, get going, relax, and think about the end and then go, that creates the feeling of safety. There is predictability is what is also needed.
Yeah, I was thinking about this framework, this structure, and it's not for very long either, is it? Each week it's only an hour.
An hour.
And only an hour.
No, it was about an hour and 10 minutes, I would say.
Yes,
an hour and 10 minutes.
An awful lot happens in that time. I think one can get lost in the stories and think, well, it goes on much longer, but I know it's very brief. But that continuity and that predictability and that framework can be very holding, and that acceptance and warmth to free up these other explorations and reflections. So yeah, that's terrific.
Now, of course, the other important thing is to have somebody to work with. I have at times worked with 2 other colleagues, and I have at times, and I'm currently working with one colleague, and this is something that I also describe in quite a lot of depth in my book about how the two of us can work, or three of us can work together, because not only are we working in the here and now for the children to be working through whatever is happening in the group, also having another colleague is enabling me to be wondering aloud, if you like. So I might say to my colleague, I wonder how you think Jimmy is feeling about that. Or I wonder how you're feeling right now, because I'm feeling I can't hear properly. There's an awful lot of noise going on. And so instead of saying, will you stop talking, or will you stop interrupting, or whatever, the children always tune in to what adults are saying. And it's a kind of wondering aloud that enables the children to hear about themselves, but also to have a role model of a relationship. So there's a role model of relationship between me and my colleague as well. And of course, because it is a therapeutic group and we need time for reflection, and I have to confess that when I'm actually leading it, because I tend to be the leader of the group, I do forget detail. I don't always remember everything, and my colleague writes down what the children say, and we can read on over it afterwards. But we also explain to the children and to the parents, and I've done this when I've worked in schools as well as myself independently, that we tell the children that we're writing things down, but what we write is confidential, and we will only share what they want us to share with others, unless of course we considered there was a safeguarding issue that came up, and of course we would be sharing it, and they know that too. And of course, when my colleague is writing out the story, then we're checking back with them, have we done it correctly? But really, so there's two threads of the importance of a colleague. Well, three in a way, because I think there's the aspect of writing down so we can reflect. A second aspect is the witness. There's two of us witnessing the same. And the third is this wondering aloud and modeling of talking to each other, and also being able to reflect on what we're observing in the group for the children to hear. And that, I would say, those are the elements really. And I would never advise any group to be run with fewer than two people. Well, only one person effectively.
So whilst we're speaking to each other, we're just in the phase of wondering whether we're going to be told we're going to be locked down again. So I wondered if you could share some experiences that the young people perhaps have talked about from during lockdown, and then in the post-lockdown or post-lockdown one phase, some of the challenges they've experienced and how the group has adapted to be able to still support them and manage some of the other anxieties or issues they've been facing.
Regarding the COVID crisis and the lockdown and the what happened, just before lockdown, the groups that I was working with were beginning to get anxious about schools closing and about the group coming to an end. And I was really, really pleased that we had those conversations with those two groups then, because they were able to talk about their fears, because literally the following Friday, everything closed and I didn't see them. And then in order to keep the thread of the friendly group going, we started to meet as Zoom calls. The benefits of that was that they were able to talk a little bit about their experiences, which I will say what it was in a minute, of being in lockdown. But it also kept this, as I say, this little thread going of the group. The disadvantages was that they really found it difficult to talk about their feelings. And I haven't fully understood why or what it was about. There's a part of me that feels that although they're all on one screen, they were all in different places. And I wonder how, even if it wasn't conscious, certainly with the teenagers it was more conscious, but the younger ones probably were not so conscious that they may have been being overheard, or maybe worrying about background noises, or just it didn't have that safety of being in the same room. So there was less talking about feelings. There was more anxious behavior, in other words, silly behavior going on. And in fact, I have to confess that there was one particular group where a group of boys, of course, far more savvy than I am on the machinery, and they were doing all sorts of silly effects and changing people's names, writing up rude things, getting faces changing. And I was finding it difficult to manage that, because we don't want to control the it's not about controlling the children, it's about helping the children. And subsequently, face to face, we've talked about that, and that's been useful to talk about it face to face since we've met face to face. But coming back to it, the challenges of Zoom, challenges of the COVID, and the what's been good have been more shared since we've been able to meet face to face again this September. What's interesting, of course, many of them have said with a smile on their faces, it's been wonderful. We've loved it, because we like, I like being at home. I could organize my own time. I could be in my pajamas all day. I could do a bit of schoolwork when I wanted to, for those who didn't get very structured, schoolwork. Some got it didn't, schools varied in the way they were able to present the work. So for some, they really had a rather lovely time, because life became less demanding. There was less sensory information, sensory overload of noisy schools and noisy classrooms. And in some ways, I've found that coming back this September, some of them have come back sort of almost rebooted with a bit more strength about life, because they've had a pause from the demands of the outside world. And they've enjoyed the nature, or they've enjoyed lots of time on their computers, or they've just enjoyed time with their pets or their families. But conversely, there have been those who have found it very difficult indeed, because autistic children aren't all introverts. They aren't all ones who just want to be on their own. And there have been some who've really found it difficult to be sociable, particularly the teenage girls. Interesting enough, some of the teenage older boys began to meet a friend on a bike or something like that. But the girls who tend to communicate on social media and all that kind of thing, they really find that difficult. They find it difficult in either they don't want to participate, or they find it difficult because they say the wrong sort of thing. And there's no face-to-face way of making it up, or there's no meeting up in school when you're feeling completely left out. So there were challenges, and there were also advantages. And what was lovely was on the first week that we all came back together, in one of the groups where there's a 14-year-old girl said, it's so good to be back in the friendly group, because here I can be completely myself. And what we can do in the friendly group is we can practice how to talk to other people, because in the lockdown, I've hardly spoken to anybody, and I find it so difficult to speak to people. And this gives me a chance to practice again for now going back to school. So she's found coming back week by week has given her the confidence and talking about what's been happening at school. So it's been varied, and like every life experience, there will be advantages and disadvantages. And the opportunity of working in a group is that a group of youngsters hear different versions. And that's what's also healthy, because they realise there's some that are like them and others that are different, and it's all okay and it's all workable.
Yeah, so many interesting things that you've been referring to in the course of discussing the book, and I just wondered if you could summarize for us some of the kind of the key themes, some of the, if you like, the universal truths, if that isn't too grand a phrase, that you feel that you've learned from the children and young people that you've worked with over time about the issues that they face and about this way of working.
Right, I suppose I think you know, as a publisher, that the book took 10 years to write, partly because all the time I was developing my ideas and thinking and understanding the children. And what I really realised is what I said at the very beginning is this therapeutic approach is about relationships and how relationships develop, and a way of enabling young people, whether they're 8 years old, whether they're 16 years old, or actually whether they're 25 or 35 years old, is a wonderful way is through this group process, this working in the here and now, which is an approach. It's not a structured element or whatever. And the themes of whatever is current in people's lives comes up through working in that way. Now, this year in 2020, the theme has been the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus, and how that pandemic has affected all our lives. But threading through that are the elements of how do I make friends? How do I stop myself from feeling left out? How do I, get to know other people my age? How do I fit in? Why do people bully me? Why can't I learn? Why am I different? All these sort of things that come up time and time again. And it's not even children on the autism spectrum, because in many ways, this book is about all children, all young people, all people actually. And many parents who have read this book identified themselves when they were children with it. They say, I'm reading about myself here. It's helping me to understand myself when I was younger, and it helps me now to understand my children now. And so there's hopefully a timeless quality to the book. The structure giving ideas for those who might run groups, whether they're speech therapists, occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, it doesn't matter what professional title, who want to run groups. I hope it will give people confidence to have a go and be flexible. But I also hope that parents who read the book, and I know from many parents who I am working with have given me feedback of how it's helped them reframe their own language with their children, within their own families, about talking about feelings. Because ultimately, relationship building is about being able to talk about your feelings and able to be honest with another person, and feel brave enough that you can be honest and be able to listen and take on board another person's honesty.
I just a funny question. I'd just like to take you back to the beginning of your career, Anita, and say if you were giving some advice to young Anita setting out in education, starting to work with children and young people who have somehow got themselves a diagnosis as being on the autistic spectrum or being autistic, or having that kind of label coming in their direction, what would you say to the young Anita?
I suppose I would say, enjoy yourself. Actually, enjoy the children you meet, because if you enjoy another person, and when I say enjoy them, be interested in them, you are not looking at yourself. I think when many of us start working, we get so nervous about, are we doing the right thing, or are we saying the right thing? But the minute you can actually be really interested in the child, in the young person, in the young adult, or even the adult if you're working with professionals, interested in them, it makes the work really go well, because that's how we all learn. Because when you start off, you might have some information and knowledge, but actually the learning really happens on the job. And I would say that 95% of my learning has been through the experiences I've had all through my working life, and that has been really quite varied. And I feel privileged to have had that experience.
It's been really lovely listening to you, Anita, and to hearing about the thinking and the practice that's gone into your book. And I know as your publisher, it took a great many hot buttered crumpets and lots of cups of tea to keep you going whilst you were writing it, and a lovely person in the background bringing those cups of tea. But it's all been hugely worthwhile. So thanks very much for talking about the process.
Thank you, Andrea. It's been a pleasure.